Paul Revere is way more important than you might realize. Let's talk about it. My name is Jason, and this is Founder of the Day. Now, we've all heard the poem, "Listen, my children, and you will hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere." Fortunately, most of what you heard is, I don't want to say wrong, but there's definitely been some strategic omissions. Now, you might know that. What you might not realize is how important Paul Revere was to the Revolution itself, and actually to America after the Revolution. So let's come back a little bit, and Paul Revere first makes his way onto the stage. He is a Mason, and he becomes friendly with certain gentlemen such as Sam Adams, Dr. Joseph Warren, that lively, loudly crew, most of whom were a little bit more wealthy than Paul Revere. Revere was a silversmith, so he did have connections to the upper class because they like to eat with silver. But that doesn't mean he was wealthy with them, but he would sell them utensils and a variety of objects that would be made using silver. But he was also connected to the lower classes because when they could afford it, they wouldn't mind having a silver spoon so they could eat like the wealthy also. So Revere was in a very interesting spot. He was an artisan. He was what we might consider today middle class, even though it wasn't really a thing at the time. If there was, he was it. So Revere makes his way up into these circles, and in 1774, the First Continental Congress is meeting. And Paul Revere makes his first real entrance onto the national stage at that point. Dr. Warren, who I mentioned, had written the Suffolk Resolves, which were very, how would I say, resolute resolutions against what the king and Parliament were doing. And Revere took those and rode to Philadelphia from Boston on horseback over the course of just a few days. And he showed up halfway through the Continental Congress. At the time, the First Continental Congress delegates were discussing what's known as the Galloway Plan. It was written by Joseph Galloway, and it's a very interesting plan in itself. And I'm sure, talk about Joseph Galloway's plan at a later date. But long story short, the Galloway Plan was an agreement that they were considering sending to England, saying, you're still the king, and Parliament is in charge, but we're going to have, the colonies will have our own Parliament that will make laws concerning just the colonies. Parliament still makes the laws regarding the high seas and the kingdom at large, but we'll have this Continental Association, which is not the right way to say it, but this governing body that can make our own taxation rules here for internal use. It's not too dissimilar from what Benjamin Franklin had proposed 20 years earlier at the Albany Conference. But Paul Revere shows up halfway through, waving these Suffolk Resolves around, and some of the northern men were like, yes, this is what we need. It's more, we need to be more aggressive with the king. A little bit more. A decade earlier, they had the Stamp Act Congress, and the letters they sent had worked, but it's happening again. So we need to be more stern this time. And Paul Revere rides back home. And then we'll say September, October, November, December, about 4 months later, all of a sudden the British are coming. But it's not Lexington and Concord. The British are, like they would later do, just 4 months later, for Lexington and Concord, the British were sending out soldiers to collect gunpowder. This time they were sending them to Fort William and Mary, right across the water from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So Paul Revere gets on his horse and sends the alarm, and he rides again all the way up to Portsmouth and says, hey, the British are coming. And the militia got called out. I believe it was John Langdon and John Sullivan, each led men, and they took the fort. For some reason, the battle, it wasn't really a battle, but the attack on Fort William and Mary really should have been the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. The British came for gunpowder. The Americans went there first, took the gunpowder, and left. And somehow cooler heads prevailed. The British left. 3 more months go by, And lo and behold, the British are again coming. This time they're coming very specifically for John Hancock and Samuel Adams, who were hiding in Lexington, Massachusetts. So Paul Revere, as the poem says, went a-riding to let them know they were coming. The thing is, Paul Revere wasn't the only rider that night. Far from it. Riders were sent in many different directions, alerting many different militias, even as far away as Connecticut and New Hampshire and Rhode Island. That's why they were able to show up so fast once the British ended up in Concord later that night or next morning. But Paul Revere was sent to get Sam Adams and John Hancock because he knew them. They were friendly. But he also, on the way, they were afraid he might get caught. So they also sent a young man named William Dawes, who meets up with Adams at one point. Then those two guys meet up with the British. And the British try and arrest them. Dawes gets away and finishes Paul Revere's famous ride. Paul Revere gets arrested and doesn't finish the ride. And I should point out, William Dawes, while he's finishing the ride, meets up with Dr. Samuel Prescott, who, modern politics aside, is a distant ancestor of both Presidents Bush. But I'm not going to get into that. Samuel Prescott and William Dawes finish the ride. And again, 20, 30, 40 other riders all finish their rides. The only one who doesn't finish is Paul Revere. And at that point, the war breaks out. And Revere, who was a rabble-rouser, and very good at that, and a good horseman, clearly, he kind of fades back a little bit. He did participate as an officer in the Battle of Penobscot Bay, forgive my pronunciation, Penobscot Bay, and it's kind of a disaster. And his brief time in the military doesn't work out very well. And then he fades into the background, because he was just an artisan. So this guy wasn't running for office. This guy was not writing any constitutions or signing any declarations. He was just giving the heads up. He was a patriot. I do not mean to take anything away from him. Like I said, he had brought probably the most important news to the First Continental Congress that they ever could have gotten. And he went on the first ride that should have started the war and the second ride that did. Years would go by. Over the 1780s, he would go back to becoming a silversmith, and he would bring his sons in to his business. And what's really interesting about Paul Revere is by the time the 1790s roll around, he is joining a burgeoning industrial revolution. He starts making molds for his silverware so that they can keep printing a lot of them, kind of an assembly line style. They didn't have an assembly line yet, but he started hiring in workers. So he would have wage labor, and he would pay them to do the same task over and over again. And he even got to the point where he started making molds to make things like nails and other building materials, so that if something broke, you didn't need to replace the whole thing. You could replace just part of it, which is a more modern industrial idea. And he was on the forefront of this. It is shocking, to say the least, that he is overlooked when it comes to the Industrial Revolution. Now, to be fair, the nation, the world was industrial revolutionizing naturally. So it's not, I can't give him all the credit, but we absolutely should give him credit for noticing this was happening and taking advantage of it. And Paul Revere and Sons would be a company for a very long time. May still be around today in some form. I'm not sure about that. But he would make everything. Eventually he would make bells, church bells, bong bong, and cannons, and really anything that could be made out of metal. He usually stuck to silver, but there, as he expanded, he put his fingers in a variety of different subjects. So, in review, in summation, Paul Revere, famous ride, not very good. 2 not famous rides, real good. And industrial revolutionary, really important. So thank you for watching today. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments. Make sure you hit like, give the thumbs up, because then other people will find it in their feeds, and that would be great. We can grow this channel together. And make sure you subscribe so that when I put something new out every weekday, you will get it. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to talking to you soon.